There are stories that change lives, stories that make you question everything you thought you knew about love, family, and trust. This is one of those stories. A tale that begins with a charming old man, a lifetime of wealth, and a smile that could melt the coldest hearts. But as the chapters unfold, what starts as a fairy tale romance spirals into a slow-motion disaster no one saw coming. If you've ever believed in happily ever afters, prepare to be shaken. And if you've ever doubted a loved one's intuition, this might make you listen next time. Enjoy the story. My grandfather was a man of old money and old manners. He wore tailored suits even on Sundays, had a driver who knew every shortcut in the city, and believed a man should never speak ill of others, especially women. But underneath all that charm was a deep loneliness that wealth couldn't soothe. My grandmother, the love of his life, passed away 10 years ago, and since then, something in him just faded. He still hosted family dinners, donated to charities, and even laughed at his old war stories. But his eyes weren't laughing. They were searching, longing for something he couldn't buy, for someone who'd see him, not as a bank account, but as a man who still had love to give. That's when she walked in. At first, she seemed like a miracle. Her name was Elise. Early 30s, graceful, elegant, with the kind of beauty that feels expensive, like it comes from old Parisian perfume and silence in art galleries. She worked as a wellness consultant at one of those upscale retreats my grandfather's friends swore by. They said she had a gift, that she made you feel heard, seen, healed. But what none of us realized was, Elise also had a talent for something else: playing roles. Because what she showed my grandfather wasn't just empathy, it was adoration, pure, undivided attention. The kind of attention a lonely man, no matter how wise or wealthy, would crave like air. The first time we met Elise was at a garden party my grandfather hosted every spring. It was his way of staying connected with the world, a tradition that had started with my grandmother years before. Usually filled with family, old friends, and a few carefully selected guests, these events had a certain timeless charm. Vintage, jazz in the background, white parasols dotting the lawn, and glasses of wine that seemed to refill themselves. That year, though, something was different. My grandfather arrived a little late, walking slower than usual, but with a strange energy. On his arm was Elise, wearing a pale green dress that flowed like water and drew every eye in the garden. She greeted everyone with that perfect balance of warmth and restraint, making each person feel important, yet somehow keeping herself slightly out of reach. It didn't take long before whispers began to stir among the cousins. Who was she? Why was she here? And more importantly, why was Grandpa looking at her like a boy seeing his first love? We tried to be polite, of course. My family isn't the kind to confront things directly. Our drama happens behind closed doors, in sharp whispers and silent glares. But even the youngest of us could see it. Grandpa was enchanted. He followed Elise with his eyes everywhere she moved. When she laughed, he laughed louder. When she excused herself to take a call, he grew restless. At dinner, she sat beside him, gently touching his arm as she spoke, and he beamed like a teenager. I remember my aunt leaning toward me and murmuring, "It's just a phase. He's grieving." But there was something about Elise that didn't feel temporary. She wasn't acting like a woman flattered by an older man's affection. She was moving like someone planting roots. And Grandpa, he wasn't grieving anymore. He was glowing, and that scared me more than if he had still been sad. In the weeks that followed, Elise became a fixture in my grandfather's life, and by extension, in ours. She moved with subtlety, like a cat weaving itself into a room, claiming space without ever making a sound. She started attending his charity functions, sitting in on his business meetings, and even had a say in the renovation of his summer house in Napa. Her name began to appear on the RSVP lists of our family events, and suddenly, every conversation seemed to circle back to her. What Elise thought, what Elise suggested, what Elise recommended. My grandfather would quote her as if her opinions carried the weight of scripture. Elise says the market is going to crash soon. maybe it's time to liquidate some assets. Elise believes I've been pushing myself too hard lately. I might take a step back. It was as if this woman, who none of us had even heard of 2 months ago, had become the axis around which his entire world spun. What struck me most wasn't how quickly Elise had embedded herself. It was how quietly she managed to shift our family's dynamic. Conversations became more guarded. Family dinners felt like auditions for approval. My aunt, who had been managing a portion of Grandpa's estate, suddenly found herself replaced by a financial advisor Elise had recommended. My cousin, who worked as his executive assistant, was encouraged to take some time off to pursue her dreams. And shortly after, Elise's friend, someone with no background in business, filled the role. Every change came under the guise of concern or efficiency, always framed as being in Grandpa's best interest. And yet, it all felt like a house being slowly rearranged by someone who didn't own it. Until one day, you realize the front door key no longer fits. But what could we do? My grandfather was still lucid, still smiling, still insisting he was finally happy again. And how do you argue with happiness? If we questioned Elise's presence too directly, we risked being seen as jealous or controlling. If we said nothing, we'd continue watching our family's legacy drift into the hands of a stranger with eyes that smiled too easily and a silence that said more than her words ever did. The truth is, no one wanted to admit it, but we were all afraid. Not just of Elise, but of the possibility that we might be wrong. That maybe, just maybe, this woman genuinely cared for him. And if that were true, then we'd be the villains in the story. The turning point came the night of my grandfather's birthday gala. It was an opulent affair. He always believed that age should be celebrated with grandeur, not whispered about in shame. The ballroom at the Ritz was transformed into a living museum of his life. Portraits from his youth adorned the walls. A string quartet played his favorite symphonies, and guests flew in from across the country. But amidst the crystal chandeliers and vintage champagne, there was one presence that commanded the room more than the man being honored: Elise. She arrived, on his arm wearing a deep sapphire gown, her hair styled in soft waves, her smile calm and commanding. The photographers, the guests, even the servers, everyone turned to her. And she knew it. She carried herself like a queen whose coronation had already happened in secret. Throughout the night, I watched her. She didn't just accompany my grandfather. She managed him, whispered in his ear when to move, where to stand, who to greet. He obeyed with a smile, but it was a different kind of smile, the kind that conceals obedience behind the illusion of choice. Then came the moment that sent ripples through the entire family. When he stepped up to give his toast, my grandfather, once sharp, poised, articulate, seemed oddly hesitant. He cleared his throat, lifted his glass, and said, "Tonight is special not just because of my birthday, but because I've decided to start a new chapter in my life, with Elise." Gasps echoed across the room like glass breaking. He paused, turned to her, and added, "We're getting married next month." The applause that followed was polite, awkward, delayed, and underneath it all, a quiet horror crept into every corner of that ballroom. No one said a word to him that night. Not one of us dared confront him in front of all those guests. But back at our table, the conversations boiled. My aunt's hands trembled as she clutched her wine glass. My uncle muttered something about a prenup. My cousins exchanged glances that bordered on panic. We all knew what this meant. A wedding wasn't just symbolic, it was legal. It meant Elise would have rights to the estate, to the properties, to everything he'd spent a lifetime building, and maybe, worst of all, to the authority to silence us. That night, for the first time, I looked at Elise not as an outsider or even a manipulator. I saw her for what she truly was, a strategist. A woman who played the long game and who was dangerously close to checkmate. The days that followed the announcement were a whirlwind of tension wrapped in forced smiles. Every member of our family scrambled to find footing in a reality that felt like a carefully orchestrated trap. Meetings were scheduled under the guise of brunches, Phone calls were made behind closed doors, and whispers turned into hushed arguments. But the most unsettling part of it all was how composed Elise remained. She never raised her voice, never snapped, never wavered. She floated through the chaos with a serene grace that made it impossible to pin her as the villain. Yet every step she took brought her closer to consolidating control. My grandfather, in contrast, seemed almost euphoric. He told anyone who would listen how blessed he felt, how Elise had given him a new reason to live. He spoke of travel plans, children she never had but wanted, and even joked about possibly starting a foundation in her name. The more he glowed, the more we dimmed. At one point, I tried to talk to him, just the two of us. I invited him to lunch at a quiet spot he used to love, a small bistro on the edge of town where he once taught me how to read stock tickers in the newspaper. As we sat there, sipping coffee and avoiding the elephant at the table, I gently asked him if he was sure. "About the marriage," I said. "It's all happening fast." He looked at me, not with anger, but with a softness that pierced deeper than any reprimand. "You think I'm being foolish," he said. "But I've been alone for a long time. She makes me feel alive again. Don't take that from me." His voice cracked slightly at the end, and in that moment, I didn't see a billionaire or a patriarch. I saw an old man, tired of being lonely, tired of eating in silence, of birthdays with empty chairs, of waking up with no one to say good morning to. And as much as I feared Elise's motives, I couldn't bring myself to shatter the fragile joy he had found. I swallowed my words, nodded slowly, and smiled. But not everyone in the family shared that restraint. My aunt, his eldest daughter, was far less diplomatic. She'd always been the keeper of the family legacy, the one who knew the exact value of every property, every investment, every charitable contribution made in our name. To her, this wasn't just a wedding, it was a hostile takeover. She lawyered, up almost immediately, digging into Elise's past, hiring private investigators and drafting legal documents that would, at the very least, protect a portion of the estate. The problem was, Elise had already gotten ahead. Quietly, strategically, and within complete legality, she'd been granted power of attorney for several assets, under the claim that she was assisting with wellness-related decisions. My grandfather had signed the documents himself, with his full signature, in ink. What we uncovered next shook the very foundation of our trust, not just in Elise, but in my grandfather's ability to protect himself. Elise, as it turned out, had a past, not a criminal record, not anything that would show up in a background check. She was far too intelligent for that. But buried beneath a trail of name changes and conveniently forgotten addresses was a pattern of wealthy, older men. Quiet romances that lasted just long enough to shift power, just long enough to change wills, to sign over assets, to isolate her lovers from their families, and then, quietly, she would vanish. No lawsuits, no drama, just a perfectly timed exit, usually accompanied by a sizable payout and the convenient explanation of a mutual separation. My aunt brought this information to my grandfather's lawyer, a man who had been with our family for over 20 years. He was stunned. "If half of this is true," he said, "then we're already late." And we were, because while we were digging into Elise's past, she was planting herself deeper into my grandfather's future. She convinced him to put one of his penthouses in her name. "A gesture of commitment," she said. He did it. She talked him into selling off part of his antique car collection, cars he had once called untouchable, to free up space for the life they were going to build together. He sold them. She even brought in her own notary during one of his wellness retreats in Aspen, where he signed documents that granted her financial oversight on specific trust accounts, under the belief that they were simply medical release forms. Every move she made was cloaked in intimacy, trust, and plausible deniability. She wasn't stealing from him. She was helping him manage his wealth more efficiently, out of love. The hardest part to swallow was that my grandfather was not oblivious. He knew his family disapproved. He saw our eyes when she entered the room, heard the tension in our voices. But he had made a decision. and he wasn't going to let anyone rob him of his happiness. In his eyes, we were the problem. We were the ones being manipulative, trying to control his life out of greed. "I'm not dead yet," he told us. "Stop treating me like I am." Those words stung more than he realized. Because in truth, none of us were trying to take his joy. We were trying to protect him from what he couldn't or wouldn't see. And it's an impossible task, trying to save someone who believes you're the enemy, especially when the person they trust most is quietly draining the life from their legacy, smile by smile. The wedding happened in Tuscany. Not because it was meaningful to either of them, but because Elise said she always dreamed of a vineyard ceremony with European charm. My grandfather obliged without hesitation. None of us were invited, not a single family member. The announcement came via a printed card, yes, printed, informing us that they had eloped and would be hosting a celebratory brunch upon their return. My aunt was livid. My cousins swore they'd never speak to him again. But I just felt numb. A part of me kept hoping it was all a twisted dream, that we'd wake up, that he'd call us apologizing, that the old man I grew up idolizing would shake off the spell. But that call never came. Instead, what came was a wave of emails from his personal assistant, well, the woman who used to be his assistant until Elise replaced her, informing us that, due to recent restructuring, several family members would no longer have access to certain properties, accounts, or vehicles tied to the family trust. Elise moved in like a monarch returning to her rightful palace. She didn't just occupy space, she redesigned it. The estate's interior, which had remained untouched since my grandmother's passing, was gutted. The old piano? Sold. The hand-painted china? Auctioned. The wall of family portraits that lined the staircase, replaced with minimalist artwork Elise claimed calmed the energy of the home. When my younger cousin visited one afternoon to drop off documents, the housekeeper, who had been with our family for over 15 years, told him she'd been let go. Elise had brought in her own staff, people we'd never met, who spoke in Chihuahua, clipped tones, and carried tablets like sentinels. The home, once a sanctuary of warm Sunday lunches and childhood laughter, now felt like a boutique hotel with no vacancy for sentiment. But the greatest blow came during the quarterly board meeting of the Family Foundation, an event that had always included the family's core leadership. My grandfather arrived flanked by Elise, now wearing a diamond ring that caught the light with every subtle hand gesture. He announced a new era of giving, one that would prioritize more modern causes and that Elise would be overseeing much of the decision-making. A few charities we had long supported, veteran housing, school scholarships in underserved areas, were abruptly cut. In their place were vague new initiatives centered on wellness tech, eco-luxury startups, and digital health ventures, all connected in some form to Elise's former clients. When one board member raised a question about conflicts of interest, Elise smiled softly and responded, "We're all here because we care. That's what matters most." And just like that, the room fell silent. It was astonishing how quickly power shifted, not just financial power, but emotional and psychological as well. My grandfather, once a man who commanded every room with quiet dignity, now deferred constantly to Elise. It was subtle at first. He would glance at her before answering questions. Then he began pausing mid-sentence to let her finish his thoughts. Eventually, he stopped speaking much at all during gatherings, simply smiling while Elise explained his decisions on his behalf. She began to act as his gatekeeper, screening his calls, canceling his meetings, deciding which family members could see him and when. My uncle tried to visit him one afternoon and was told by the new security team that Mr. and Mrs. Langford are not receiving visitors today. Mr. and Mrs. Langford. The name hit like a slap. It wasn't just a formality. It was a declaration. She wasn't playing a role anymore. She had become the role. I wish I could say there was a breaking point, a moment where it all unraveled and the truth came crashing down. But that's not how Elise operated. She didn't make mistakes. She bled us slowly, methodically. Over the course of a year, she transitioned nearly every major asset into structures where she held executive power or joint ownership. She opened shell companies in his name and positioned herself as CEO of each one, citing his declining energy and desire to simplify. Even his health became her domain. She hired private doctors, demanded second opinions, adjusted his medication schedule, all under the guise of care. And my grandfather, he complied. He trusted her. Maybe because he didn't want to admit he'd been wrong. Or maybe because deep down, he knew and just didn't care anymore. After a lifetime of being in control, maybe surrendering felt like a relief. For us, every attempt to intervene hit a wall. Legally, she had done everything by the book. There were signatures, records, witnesses. She never pressured him publicly. And every time we confronted him, he waved us off with that same weary line. "I'm happy. Isn't that what matters?" And in those moments, it was hard to argue. Because how do you save someone who has convinced themselves they don't need saving? And worse, who's convinced you're the one causing the harm? Elise didn't just isolate him from us physically. She reprogrammed his sense of trust. She painted us as vultures, resentful of his happiness. And the worst part, the more we pushed, the more we fulfilled that image. We became exactly who she said we were. The unraveling didn't come with a bang. It came with a whisper. A quiet voicemail left on my phone at 2:47 a.m. by the one person I never expected to hear from again. Our old housekeeper, Maria. Her voice trembled as she said, "You need to see your grandfather. He's not well, not like they're saying." She had stayed in touch with one of the former drivers who still had access to the estate for deliveries. According to him, my grandfather hadn't been seen outside the house in over 2 weeks, not even for his daily morning walks, the ritual he'd kept for over 3 decades. That same day, my aunt and I drove to the estate, prepared to be turned away. But as fate would have it, the gates were malfunctioning. We slipped through just as the delivery van pulled out, unnoticed by the guards Elise had stationed at the front. What we found inside stopped us cold. The grand halls, once echoing with music and laughter, were silent, sterile. The scent of lavender that always hung in the air had been replaced by something cold, clinical, like a hospital that had been disguised as a home. We made our way to his study, the room where he used to write letters by hand, read Tolstoy by the fire, sipped cognac while quoting Roosevelt. And there he was, my grandfather, alone, thin, slouched in a leather armchair, his once proud posture sunken into the cushions. His eyes, once sharp and knowing, were glazed with confusion. A tray of untouched food sat beside him, cold. A bottle of pills lay on the table, its label partially torn. He looked up at us, and for a moment, he didn't recognize us. That moment shattered me more than anything Elise had done. We stayed with him for hours. Didn't ask questions, didn't make accusations, just talked. Told him stories from when we were kids, reminded him of holidays, of my grandmother's laugh, of the time he let us sneak cookies before dinner. Slowly, something shifted. A flicker returned to his eyes. He reached out and took my hand, and in that trembling grip, I felt the man I knew clawing his way back. He whispered, "I thought I was helping her, but I think I helped her too much." It was the first time he'd acknowledged it. Even then, it was barely above a whisper. But it was enough. We knew we had to act. Fast. Before Elise returned. Before she found a way to spin this moment into another manipulation. The window of opportunity was narrow, dangerously narrow. Elise was out of town, allegedly attending a wellness conference in Switzerland, though we later discovered no such event existed. My aunt and I took immediate action. First, we contacted my grandfather's old attorney, the one Elise had quietly nudged into early retirement. To our surprise, he answered on the first ring. He hadn't forgotten us, and more importantly, he hadn't forgotten my grandfather. After we explained everything, he agreed to come the next morning, bringing a notary and 2 trusted medical professionals to assess my grandfather's condition. We were careful not to raise suspicion. Every move had to be deliberate, quiet. Elise had left digital fingerprints everywhere, cameras in the house, emails rerouted through her own assistants. Even voice commands on his devices altered to default, to her preferences. It was like trying to defuse a bomb with a blindfold. By mid-morning, my grandfather was slowly regaining clarity. The doctor's assessment was sobering. He had been over-medicated. Prescriptions that should have been carefully balanced had been doubled, and in one case, substituted with a sedative not meant for someone his age. It wasn't malpractice. It wasn't even criminal, technically. It was just subtle enough to escape legal consequence, but devastating enough to turn a sharp mind into a docile one. When the lawyer asked him if he felt coerced or pressured into any recent decisions, my grandfather hesitated, then nodded. Just once. That was enough to start the process. We initiated emergency conservatorship proceedings and froze key accounts, pending further investigation. For the first time in over a year, the control Elise had meticulously built began to slip from her fingers. We expected Elise to return furious, to threaten lawsuits, to storm the estate demanding answers. But she didn't. Instead, she disappeared. No return flight, no texts. Her number was disconnected within a week. The penthouse in her name was emptied out overnight. The wellness companies she had recommended were suddenly under review or shuttered. A few of her former associates tried to reach out, offering vague apologies and distancing themselves from her completely. It was as if she had never existed at all. She left behind no explanation, no farewell, not even a note. Just silence and a trail of perfectly legal destruction. And my grandfather, he wept. Not for the money, not for the foundation or the estate or the cars. He wept because he loved her. And for a brief, brilliant moment, he believed she loved him too. In the aftermath, there were no dramatic revelations, no hidden treasure maps, no secret confessions tucked into drawers, just a long, painful audit of finances, of memories, of trust. My grandfather spent the following weeks in a rehabilitation center, not just to recover physically from the damage Elise had inflicted, but to process emotionally what had happened. He was quieter now, less opinionated, more reflective. Sometimes he'd stare out the window for hours without saying a word. Other times he'd ask questions that broke my heart. Do you think she ever really cared? Was any of it real? None of us had the courage to lie, because the truth is we didn't know. Elise had blurred the line between affection and strategy so masterfully that even now, in hindsight, we couldn't untangle the genuine moments from the manipulative ones. And maybe that's what made her so dangerous. Not that she lied, but that she mixed truth into her deception just enough to make you doubt your own instincts. Rebuilding the estate was easier than rebuilding the relationships. The damage Elise left behind wasn't just financial, it was psychological. Family members who once shared holidays and childhood memories now barely spoke. There were lingering resentments, unspoken accusations. Who saw the signs first? Who stayed silent too long? Who should have done more? Trust, once fractured, doesn't heal with paperwork. My aunt stepped in to manage the trust again, but this time with more rigid protocols. Lawyers were rotated, assets diversified, donations scrutinized. It all felt sterile, safe, but cold. Like a museum rebuilt after a fire, intact, but without the soul it once had. My grandfather noticed too. He once said to me, "We've protected the money, but have we lost the love?" And in many ways we had. Love had become something fragile, something to second guess, something to guard against. We started seeing motives in every gesture, caution in every compliment. Even I, who once believed so fiercely in the idea of unconditional love, found myself wondering where the line was between kindness and manipulation. And yet, amidst that chaos, something beautiful began to emerge. A new kind of bond with my grandfather. Not the childlike idolization I once held, but a deeper, more honest connection. We'd sit together in the garden, what was left of it, and talk about everything. About mistakes, about hope, about how sometimes the cost of being human is trusting the wrong person, and how sometimes that trust is the last gift we give. As the seasons changed, so did my grandfather. Slowly, deliberately, he began to reclaim pieces of himself. Not the empire builder, not the old money patriarch, but the man beneath the legacy, the widower, the dreamer, the human being who had spent so many years wearing roles for the sake of duty. He took up painting again, something he hadn't done since my grandmother passed. He painted mostly abstract landscapes, wide skies, tangled forests, oceans without borders. I asked him once what they meant, and he smiled. They're what freedom looks like when you've been trapped too long. It was the closest he ever came to saying what Elise had done to him. He never uttered her name again, not out of bitterness, but because, in his words, she's already taken enough space in this family. I won't give her my words too. That winter, the estate hosted its first true family gathering since before Elise. It wasn't extravagant, no. String quartets, no designer chefs, no choreographed speeches, just us. Real conversations, mismatched chairs, food that got cold while we laughed too hard to care. It wasn't perfect. Some relatives still held grudges. Some sat in silence longer than they should have. But there was warmth. And for the first time in a long while, we weren't orbiting around a single person's control. We were standing on equal ground again. My grandfather didn't sit at the head of the table that night. He sat in the middle, between stories, between laughter, between forgiveness and healing. It was symbolic in a way that none of us needed to say aloud. He was with us, not above us, not hidden behind someone else's shadow, but there were remnants, always remnants. Elise's ghost lingered in subtle ways. Certain habits my grandfather couldn't shake, certain rooms he avoided, certain faces and photos that had been taken down and never returned to their place. There were lawsuits still pending, corporate entanglements she had left behind, investments tied to offshore accounts, legal fees that drained energy more than funds. My aunt handled them with quiet ferocity, but even she admitted one day over tea, "It's not about the money anymore. It's about the principle. I can't let her be the last one to win." I understood her. We all did. But I also knew the real victory wasn't in courts or contracts. It was in that quiet night at the dinner table, in the way we laughed again, in the way my grandfather held my niece on his lap and told her a story about a boy who once thought wealth was everything, until he learned that love, when real, doesn't have a price tag. Months passed, and though the echoes of Elise's manipulation still haunted the edges of our lives, the family began to breathe again. But beneath that fragile peace, there remained a lingering question. How could someone so intelligent, so respected, fall for something so calculated? It was a question I wrestled with often, until one rainy afternoon, my grandfather finally offered an answer I never expected. We were sitting in his study, a fresh fire crackling as he worked on yet another one of his brooding oil paintings. I asked him gently, "Did you really not see what she was doing?" He paused, looked up at me with eyes no longer clouded by shame or denial, and said, "I saw enough. But when you've been lonely long enough, you'll take the illusion of love over the reality of silence." That answer gutted me, because it wasn't ignorance that led him into Elise's arms. It was hunger. A hunger not for companionship, but for connection. For the feeling of being seen, desired, needed. He knew the risk. On some level, he even suspected the truth. But the way she made him feel, that was something no amount of wealth or logic could protect him from. And in that moment, I realized something that changed the way I viewed everything that had happened. My grandfather hadn't been tricked because he was weak. He had been tricked because he was human. And sometimes, being human means choosing a beautiful lie over a painful truth, because even lies can feel like salvation when the nights are long enough. But Elise didn't just take money. She stole time, precious years that could have been spent with us, with his grandchildren, with the life he'd spent decades building. And yet, despite everything, he refused to let her define the ending of his story. He sold the penthouse she left behind and donated every penny to the school he once attended as a boy. He established a scholarship in my grandmother's name and started writing letters, handwritten ones, to each of us, telling us stories about his life that he'd never shared before. They weren't apologies. They were bridges, invitations, to reconnect not through guilt, but through legacy, through truth, through vulnerability. The scandal eventually faded from public view. The press, which had once fawned over Elise as the wellness mogul who married a titan of industry, lost interest once she vanished. No exposés, no trials, just silence. And in that silence, we rebuilt. Not perfectly, not without scars, but with intention. My grandfather, frailer now but lucid and warm, told me something I'll never forget as he looked out over the garden she once redesigned. She tried to rewrite my ending, but the pen was always in my hand. I just forgot I was holding it. Time has a way of softening the edges of even the harshest memories. As the months turned into years, Elise became less of a presence and more of a shadow, one that lingered only when we passed certain places, heard certain songs, or caught glimpses of old news headlines archived on the internet. My grandfather never spoke of her again after that rainy afternoon. It wasn't denial, it was choice. He chose not to grant her power over the remaining chapters of his life. He filled his days with small joys, tending to his roses, volunteering at the local library, mentoring young entrepreneurs who reminded him of the man he once was. He had nothing to prove anymore, nothing to guard. The empire had been shaken, yes, but it had not crumbled, and neither had he. I noticed the biggest change in how he began to treat people. My grandfather had always been polite, charismatic, and generous, but now he was something else, present. He listened more than he spoke. He laughed without needing to dominate the room. He offered advice only when asked. It was as if he'd been stripped down to his essence by the storm Elise brought into his life. And instead of rebuilding the walls, he decided to live without them. He told me once, "You can't control how people love you, but you can control how you love them back. That's where the power is." Those words stuck with me, because for so long we believed he had been a victim, and in many ways he had. But he never let that be his identity. He reclaimed his power, not by punishing Elise, but by choosing who he would become after her. One morning, I found him in the garden, painting again. This time it was different. Gone were the heavy skies and stormy oceans. On his easel was a sunrise, vivid, unapologetic, full of light. "It's not perfect," he said, noticing me watching. "But it's mine." That painting hangs in my living room now. A daily reminder that even when you've lost your way, even when your heart's been used and your trust betrayed, you can still begin again. You can still create beauty from the ashes. And maybe that's the cruel irony. Elise never understood. She thought she was ending his story, but all she did was give him a new reason to write another chapter. In the final years of his life, my grandfather seemed lighter, not in body, for age had clearly taken its toll, but in spirit. There was a clarity in his gaze, a peace in his demeanor, as if he had finally laid down the burdens he'd carried for so long. He no longer chased influence or clung to legacy. He found purpose in simplicity. He wrote letters, not to CEOs or political donors, but to his great-grandchildren, still learning to read. He passed down stories, not of conquest or wealth, but of failure, of heartbreak, of being fooled, and learning to forgive himself. "The most expensive lesson I ever learned," he wrote in one letter, "is that love, real love, doesn't dazzle you. It roots you. Anything that blinds you, that burns too hot, is likely a fire you'll get lost in." That line was later etched on his gravestone, not because it was poetic, but because it was honest. Before he passed, he made one last request. Not a grand gesture, not a legal amendment, just a conversation. He asked to speak with every family member individually. No lawyers, no witnesses, just one-on-one moments. When my turn came, I didn't know what to expect. I'd forgiven him. Yes, but there were still questions in my heart. Did he regret it all? Did he miss her? Was he ashamed? But when I sat down across from him, he didn't let me ask a single question. He just smiled and said, "You stayed. That's what I remember. Not what I lost, but who stayed." And just like that, the years of tension, silence, suspicion, they all melted. Because in the end, it wasn't about the money. It wasn't even about Elise. It was about the bond we fought to preserve. After his funeral, we gathered in the same garden where he had once introduced Elise to us all. It had changed again. The lavender was back. The portraits had returned. The laughter, though softened by grief, was real. And as we stood there, surrounded by the echoes of everything we had endured, I realized something profound. Elise didn't destroy our family. She tested it. And though she nearly broke it, we had survived. Not through revenge, not through wealth, but through truth, loyalty, and love. My grandfather had made mistakes, deep ones, expensive ones, but he didn't die a fool. He died a man who faced his flaws, sought healing, and gave his family the most valuable inheritance of all, a second chance. In the end, my grandfather's story became less about the fall and more about the return. His journey was not a cautionary tale meant to scare others from love, nor a financial horror story about gold diggers and betrayal. It was something deeper, something human, a story about how even the wisest hearts can be misled when they're hungry for connection. A story about how power, when filtered through loneliness, becomes fragile, and how sometimes the most dangerous thing you can give a stranger isn't your money, it's your trust. But also, and perhaps more importantly, his story became one of redemption. Because despite the deception, despite the pain, despite nearly losing everything, he found his way back. Not by force, not through lawsuits or vengeance, but by looking inward, by accepting that even he, with all his experience and wealth, had been vulnerable and choosing not to be defined by it. That final year, he did something no one expected. He began to visit other retirement homes, not to donate, but to talk, to listen, to sit with other men and women who had lost spouses, whose adult children were too busy, whose lives had grown quiet. He shared his story, not with shame, but with humility. And in doing so, he gave others permission to speak about their regrets, about their own Elises, about the ache that silence leaves behind. He didn't seek recognition for it. Most people didn't even know who he really was. To them, he was just an old man with kind eyes and a weathered voice. But to the people he spoke with, he was a lifeline. Proof that even when you've been used, you're still worthy of love. That even when someone steals years from you, there are still chapters left to write. I sometimes wonder what Elise thinks when she sees our name in the news now. When she hears about the new scholarship programs, the Children's Literacy Fund, the rebuilt foundation. Maybe she feels nothing. Maybe she moved on to someone else. Maybe she's living in some coastal city, sipping imported wine and convincing her next mark that she's their missing piece. But then I remember what my grandfather once said. There's a difference between taking from someone and building something with them. One leaves you with emptiness, the other with legacy. Elise may have taken a lot, but she gave us something without intending to: clarity. And that clarity helped us rebuild, stronger and more honest than before. So if there's one lesson to take from all this, it's this: love deeply, but don't confuse affection with investment. Guard your heart, but don't let it harden. And above all, when someone tries to write your story for you, remember what my grandfather learned far too late. The pen has always been in your hand.